Again, thank you. And on behalf of Executive Director Craig Hartley and the entire Commission, I want to thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation to your community, Chief. My name is Daniel Shaw. I am the Regional Program Manager assigned to the Great Lakes region, Calea's Great Lakes region, and I have the pleasure of assisting over 182 agencies seeking accreditation or maintaining accreditation in the Great Lakes. A little bit about me before I get started is I joined Calea in 2014 after retiring with over 30 years of experience in municipal public safety. The last 10 years as Chief of Police in the city of Norton Shores, Michigan, which is, if you could take US 31 directly north into Michigan, about halfway up, you'd find Norton Shores, because both cities I worked for before US 31 traversed straight on through. So we're almost neighbors because we're connected by a highway. Let me get into a little bit of information about Calea, and I'm going to also talk about our process, and then we'll jump into some specific standards information. And at the end, if any of you have any questions, specific questions, I'd be happy to help you there as well. So first, the origins of Calea are such as it's very similar to a time period back in the 1960s that we have currently going on in the world. Calea was started after the civil unrest in the 1960s, and there was a presidential commission that was created in 1971 to address issues not only with policing, but with the criminal justice system as a whole. So there were 6 different reports that were produced in 1973. One on, for example, on corrections or jails, another on the courts, another on prosecutions. But there was one manual that was specifically for policing, and that was done by the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards. And this was the first set of standards actually created by the federal government for law enforcement agencies. But that was a voluntary program, very similar to what ours is now, but it was also, no one ever picked up the ball, if you will, and started with those original standards until 1979, when the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and the Police Executive Research Forum got together and collectively created what is now known as Calea, or the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. We were created by those 4 parent organizations as a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. Calea was intentionally created as an independent organization from all 4 of those parenting organizations, meaning we receive no funding from any of those agencies, nor do we provide any of the funding that we receive back to those agencies. The only connection we still maintain with the 4 parent organizations at this point is they confirm or approve our commissioners, and they also have input into our standards creation. But as far as the day-to-day organization operations of our organization, we are totally independent. Calea was set up as a non-regulatory body, meaning the standards we create are voluntary in nature. There is no regulation requiring agencies to adopt these standards. We are also non-investigative in nature, meaning while we do audits of law enforcement and public safety agencies, we are not charged, nor do we have the jurisdiction to actually do investigations, for example, in police misconduct cases or excessive force cases. We are merely an auditing and credentialing organization, set the standards, and then verify that agencies actually meet those standards. Our commission, you may be interested to know more about them. Our commission is made up of 21 members. 11 of those members must be from the law enforcement field, and they come from various state, local, county, and campus law enforcement agencies. and then 10 of our commissioners must come from other public or private organizations. And currently we have a state senator, we have city council members, we have 2 judges. One is a district court judge here in Michigan. I'm sorry, a circuit court judge in Michigan, which handles felony cases, level cases. And the other is a Supreme Court justice from the state of South Carolina. We have a communications director and also members of academia on the commission. So our role was twofold back in 1979 when we were created. We were first tasked with creating a set of professional standards specifically for law enforcement agencies. We were also then charged with creating a voluntary credentialing program or accreditation program for agencies who wished to adopt those standards, and then we would verify that they did indeed meet those standards. So we started in 1979 and created the first manual, which is Law Enforcement Accreditation Manual. And we are now in the 6th edition, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But as our organization grew and as word of accreditation kind of spread within the public safety profession, more agencies wished to join organizations such as this. And so Calea created and partnered with other organizations to create a standalone communications accreditation program, a standalone training academy program, and a program for non-sworn campus security. So it'd be campus security agencies that do not have the power to make physical arrests. As I mentioned before, we are in our 6th edition of the Law Enforcement Manual. Just a little background on this manual. We endeavored with years of experience, years of research and development to create this document, and reached out to many subject matter experts in the field, as well as received input from our client agencies and our 4 parent organizations. This 6th edition manual was adopted in April 2017. We created a transition policy as part of this manual, meaning that as agencies were going through the accreditation process, depending where they were in a cycle, really dictated when they had to advance to the 6th edition from the 5th edition. And we'll talk a little bit about that as far as where Columbus is at. And then lastly, what's most important about the 6th edition standards is that we included concepts that came from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And there's a picture of that document that's up now. And also we took information from various consent decrees that were occurring throughout the country from the Department of Justice. Consent decrees meaning there's a court order requiring reform within a law enforcement agency. So we looked at those consent decrees to kind of determine where changes need to be made in our standards, and then applied those to the standards. Just to give you a brief overview of what our standards cover, here are all the chapter titles. And I know this is really small. I'll just leave it there for a minute. Just understand that our law enforcement standards manual covers everything from the organization itself, how an organization is formed, its legal responsibilities, all the way through patrol activities, investigative activities, juvenile operations, crime prevention and community involvement, and then things as technical as records retention, collection and preservation of evidence, and property and evidence control. So you can see there's a whole wide range of topics there, and it's very difficult at this point if there's an issue within an agency that isn't addressed by a standard. I'd be quite shocked. I mean, it's really quite comprehensive. Recently, the Commission adopted 6 standards that took immediate effect. And this is something that's very rarely done within our Commission. Typically, when they make changes to standards, an agency has 1 year to come into compliance with those standards. But for these 6 issues, our commission decided they were of such importance that agencies had to take immediate action to place them into effect. And so these were adopted August 17 of 2020 by our commission. And as you see the list there, and I'll go into a little bit of detail, but I'm not going to show you all of the standards. I can show them later if you wish. But duty to intervene simply means the agency has to have a policy or a written directive that requires members to either intervene or I should say and report the situation to a supervisor whenever they observe excessive use of force, whenever they observe a violation of federal, state, local laws, or a violation of their department policies and procedures. So it's quite comprehensive, but it requires members to intervene when possible and also to report that to their supervisors. The second one on that list is use of reasonable force. What changed in this standard compared to what we had before is that the commission added that officers in the use of force, they must use reasonable force, but they must also apply de-escalation techniques. And so that is a very important training issue right now, obviously for law enforcement agencies. And so the commission enacted that right in the standard. We also made modifications to the use of deadly force standard, specifically recommending that agencies in their policies and procedures require officers to give warning when possible prior to the use of deadly force. Fourth one is duty to render aid. This is just a retooling of this directive from the past. We've always had a standard that required providing aid to anyone after the use of force, but now it requires a procedure. Exactly how is that to be done, so that you don't have officers basically using force and then providing just minimal aid. Now you have to spell out how you're going to render aid, how you're going to call for emergency medical services, that type of issue. The next 2 standards really are, a lot of people think they're the same thing, but they really are not. This is a new standard requiring agencies who authorize vascular neck restrictions to provide detailed training, initial training, but also provide training every other year, which also requires testing and proof that the officer who's been trained in this technique knows how to use it. Vascular neck restrictions is a specific technique taught by a particular company that provides use of force training. And so some of the agencies within our system utilize that provider. And the commission decided, rather than restricting or prohibiting that altogether, they put strict restrictions on when you could use it, but also the training aspect of it as well. And the last one is pretty self-explanatory. Chokeholds are prohibited by our standards, except in cases when deadly force is justified. And so agencies now have to incorporate that into their policy. And from my discussions with many of the agencies in the Great Lakes region anyway, most already had that prohibition in their directives. So a little bit about our accreditation program now. So we talked about the standards manual. Let's talk a little bit about our accreditations programs. And actually, got an email just before this meeting started. My numbers are actually wrong as of today. So we had one more client agency join today. So we have almost 1,200 agencies in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Barbados participating in our 4 different accreditation programs. Here's a listing of the agencies in Indiana. that have either received accreditation or who are working towards accreditation. As you can see, the names in yellow are all the ones who have received accreditation already. So most of the agencies in Indiana that I'm working with anyway have already achieved their initial accreditation. Several are attempting additional programs, like Marion County Sheriff's Department is seeking law enforcement accreditation. However, they're already accredited in Communications and Training Academy. Our law enforcement accreditation program actually consists of 2 levels of accreditation. Advanced accreditation, which basically for us means we are going to apply all 459 standards within that 6th edition manual against the agency's policies, procedures, directives to ensure that the agency is in compliance. There's also basic accreditation, which includes 181 of the most critical standards of the 459. Our accreditation awards currently are valid for 4 years, and they also require an annual status certification by the CEO, meaning that every year, Chief Richardson must supply to me a report, and a certified report, that his agency is still in compliance with all of the standards, and he must report to me any changes in that compliance status. I then report that to the Commission. What are the benefits of our accreditation programs? Well, there's several, and you can read some of them here, but the way I look at it, as a former police chief, accreditation provides a roadmap. It provides a roadmap to managing a professional organization. It's basically a tool in the chief's toolbox. I looked at it more as a way of a report card of my abilities and what I've been doing with the agency, rather than, if you will, a performance evaluation you may receive from your supervisor. So I looked at it as my performance evaluation and what we're doing. The most important thing is that accreditation provides a structured process for self-assessment. So an agency can take a look at itself and determine where it needs to improve, but also there's independent validation from subject matter experts to ensure that the agency has adhered to those best practices. Our process can be described, and this is my terminology, not anyone else's, but I call it the process P. And I'll show you why that occurs. An agency who enrolls, and obviously Columbus, Indiana is way past enrollment. You're in your second reaccreditation phase at this point, but you did do this process earlier. So the agency enrolled, they went into their initial self-assessment period, and I'll describe that more in a minute. And then they conducted some assessments. A web-based assessment or an off-site assessment at that time, and a site-based assessment by our assessors. The assessments were then reviewed by our commission, and the commission decided whether or not to award accreditation to Columbus, Indiana, in which they did. And so the agency was awarded their initial accreditation. At that point, the agency enters a cycle of continuous compliance. And by that, I mean, with the 4-year process that we have now, every year, not only does the chief need to send that report to me certifying that the agency is still in compliance, but we are going to have assessors check the agency's files. Every year, we check 1/4 of the standards to ensure that they're in compliance. So it's a spot check or audit during those 4-year time period. And then the 4th year, we conduct another site-based assessment with 2 independent assessors. We have another commission review and another award. And then the process starts all over again. So you're kind of stuck in that upper loop of the P, or I shouldn't say stuck, but you're in that upper loop of the P for the rest of the duration when you're in the accreditation program. I mentioned the first part of the self-assessment process, and that is the most important step in my mind. Having done this process from ground up in a previous agency and then becoming the chief of an accredited agency, I can tell you that this initial process is the most important. And even though this is done mainly in the initial part, Columbus, Indiana does this every year, because when they re-enter after an assessment, an annual assessment, you jump right back into the self-assessment period again for a matter of months, and then you have another assessment. So what happens during that self-assessment is this. They're conducting what I call a gap analysis. The agency reviews the Calea standards to see what they currently are based on any changes that have occurred, similar to the 6 changes I outlined earlier, and they determine if their directives or their practices are in compliance with those standards. And if they're not, they take action to bring them into compliance. Okay. Now that's not the last step. Even though they bring their policy and procedure into compliance, they also need to provide proofs of compliance. They need to show us or verify to Calea assessors that they have indeed met those standards through the work of their employees. And so we usually review police reports, videotapes, audio recordings, that type of information to verify that an agency has indeed complied with the Calea standards. We do provide the agency with software to do this, and here's a screenshot of the software. And I see that Mary Gerard, the accreditation manager for Columbus PD, is sitting in the training room there, the meeting room. So she's very familiar with this program. But just in a nutshell, real quick, on the top section is our standard. So 4.1.1, a written directive states that personnel will only use reasonable force to accomplish lawful objectives and apply de-escalation techniques when possible. That is the standard by Calea, and the agency must have a written directive, which means a policy, procedure, and order that requires that of their personnel. So the first thing that needs to happen is that the agency needs to make sure they have that policy. And down below, I show a copy of a policy. This is from the National Consensus Policy on Use of Force. And it's a document that Calea and a number of other organizations helped draft. It's a draft policy that's made available for everyone. And in that policy, you can see where I highlighted it. It states exactly what the standard does, that the officers must use only objectively reasonable force to bring an incident under control. Now, there's a second step of that standard, which is that de-escalation technique. And so I have to move to the next slide to show you where that is highlighted. And here's that section on de-escalation. So this is a 2-part policy for the model policy, national model policy, but both of those sections together come into compliance with the Calea standard. But like I mentioned earlier, it's not good enough just to have your policy in place. You also have to prove that you're doing it. And so the next part, I don't actually have a police report from Columbus or anybody else. So I have a draft report here, or a template. So this is what we would see from Columbus PD. It was a copy of one of their reports, and they would highlight in that report where officers only used objective force and applied de-escalation techniques. So that's what we will be expecting to see in their upcoming assessments. So this kind of work here, viewing all of this documentation, is what's done during our web-based assessments. And for Columbus, Indiana Police Department, that's being done now every year. We're reviewing 25% of their standards every year by doing just what I walked through here with these screenshots. The last part of the process will be another site-based assessment. For our process now, we will be sending a minimum of 2 independent assessors to Columbus, Indiana. At least I hope we will by this time. Our assessments currently have, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been doing everything via Zoom, WebEx, like this meeting, as much as we can because of travel so difficult at this point. So At some point when we get back to doing actual travel, our assessors hopefully will be able to visit Columbus, Indiana in person. Our 2 assessors must be from outside of the state of Indiana to go to Columbus. That is one of the rules that we have. They also must make conflict of interest disclosures. And so we try to eliminate all conflicts of interest with our assessors beforehand, meaning if Chief Richardson happens to know of an assessor in Michigan, let's say his name is Dan Shaw, because I used to be an assessor, and if the chief and I knew each other and I was selected to go to his agency to do the assessment, both of us really would have to disclose that we knew each other, and I would be removed then from that assessment team, and they'd find somebody else that was totally independent. We try to remove all conflicts of interest from our process as much as is totally possible. So that's one thing that we do require of our assessors. Once the assessors do complete their work, they will reduce that into writing. They'll create a report, and that report is later on sent to our assessment manager. I, as the regional program manager, am removed from that entire process because I have a relationship with Columbus, Indiana Police Department. In fact, I've been in that training room that the chief is sitting in probably 3 times, I think, probably more. So obviously I know the personnel there, and that could be a conflict of interest for me. So I am totally removed from that process as well. And so there's an assessment manager that is totally removed from the agency. She is the one that determines if the report is appropriate or not and makes any last minute changes to that report. Our on-site assessments will last for either 3 or 4 days, depending on whether the agency is in basic accreditation or in advanced accreditation. Some additional days may be required for larger agencies, such as a Chicago, Illinois Police Department assessment took 7 days and had many more assessors. I think they had 7 assessors on a review of that agency. The on-site assessment done by those 2 independent assessors basically facilitates interviews and observations of agencies' practices, but also interviews of agency personnel and community members. During that time period, we're going to request that the agency do what's called an agency display, where we get to see patrol cars and uniforms and special vehicles, that type of thing, similar to this photograph here with one of our assessors who's reviewing an agency. But also we're going to complete agency tours, and it sounds like a tour might not be a good name for it because it's not just a show and tell kind of thing. The assessors are really looking for compliance level information when they're walking through an agency. So they're looking at the evidence room to ensure that it's secure. They're looking at patrol cars to make sure that they're properly marked and lighted and that type of thing. So they're looking for compliance level information, not just a show and tell, if you will. The most critical parts of our on-site assessments are the last 2. The agency must publicize and conduct a public hearing, and the agency must publicize and conduct a telephone call-in session. During those 2 time periods, citizens, employees, anyone can speak with the assessors directly and provide their information about the police agency that we're reviewing. So I'll give you, in just a minute, I'll give you the dates of future assessments for Columbus PD, and so you'll be able to see those. But these 2 areas are critical for us and critical for our commission, because this is the point in time when citizens and the community members get to have input, good or bad, into how the agency is complying with our standards. So I mentioned already that the Columbus, Indiana Police Department had previously enrolled and already has completed 2 cycles of accreditation. So here are the dates for those. The agency enrolled in April of 2012 and completed its first assessment in August of 2014, and it was awarded accreditation November 2014. The agency then completed its first reaccreditation cycle, which truthfully is probably the most difficult because in the initial accreditation cycle, a lot of discretion is given as far as the proofs of compliance portion. We're not looking for 3 or 4 years of proofs of compliance. If an agency can just show us one, we're happy with that. We're looking more for process type information. But in the reaccreditation cycle, now you have to prove you did it for 4 years. And so now we're really getting into detail as far as those proofs of compliance. And so the first reaccreditation cycle is always the most difficult. And Columbus PD completed that in August of 2017, and it was reaccredited in November of 2017. Currently, the agency is in its second reaccreditation cycle and has already completed 2 web-based assessments, with the third web-based assessment coming up in November of 2020. Then you'll see another web-based assessment next May, and then their site-based assessment follows 40 days afterwards, which is July 12 through 14. So sometime in that July 12 through 14 timeframe, there will be a public information session and a call-in session that will be provided, and the agency will provide or will publicize that information. If everything goes well, the agency will be reviewed for reaccreditation at our November 2021 meeting. And I don't recall where that's going to be, but that really doesn't matter anymore. So we will review their reaccreditation status in November of 2021. So that's all I have prepared. I'm more than happy to take any questions, and if anyone has any standards related questions, I could flip over to my other screen and start looking things up, and we can show you those too if you wish. So I'll open it up to the floor.
Dan, I did receive one question. The question was, what percentage of compliance is required? Is it 8% of police reports must be completed with the standards, or is it 100%? So what percentage was the question?
Well, this is an audit-like process, and so compliance we review need to be in compliance. I mean, there's no percentage of meeting the scale. There are some situations where, for example, if an agency, let's fall back to that one example I had with that screenshot I showed you. If an agency had a use of force directive and it was in compliance with the standard, but they didn't include the de-escalation techniques because they hadn't updated their manual yet, the assessors will allow them to do that. They will allow them to make that update, but then they will report that to the commission that it was not completed at that time, and that's what's called a standards issue. And so we call it out to the attention of the commissioners that this activity hadn't been completed. And the same would be true if it was an inspection or an audit that hadn't been completed when it was supposed to be. It'll be noted for the commission. The commission can either deny accreditation to an agency, or what they could do, and what they usually do, is they will place conditions on that agency, meaning they will reaccredit the agency under the condition that they have an extra review next year. So the commission will actually review them the following year again to make sure they did uphold the standard after it was corrected. So I don't know, I think I answered that question, but there's no set percentage. They have to be in compliance or they're not. That basically is the way it is.
Next question is, what is the number of law enforcement agencies eligible for accreditation in the U.S.?
I wish I had an answer to that because we really do not know how many law enforcement agencies there are in the United States. We are guessing, based on information from the FBI, They produce a report called Crime in the United States every year. It's usually about a year and a half behind the current calendar year. But in that report, they outline police agencies and the number of members for each police agency. Unfortunately, it's not required that agencies provide that information. So because of that, we really don't have a good number. We believe, based on our data, we estimate that we represent about accredited agencies represent about 6%, 5 to 6% of the law enforcement agencies in this country. But that correlates to about 25% of the law enforcement officers, because we tend to have some of the larger agencies are accredited, while we know that most police agencies in the country are 50 members or less. So there's a lot of agencies in that lower size range that do not participate with us.
Appears to be all the questions that I have received. Does anybody else have any questions that's listening in? Anybody here have questions?
Does this cover counties and townships too? I noticed airports were on that.
That are accredited.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that if it was directed to me.
Yeah, there's county agencies like airport agencies and those things that are accredited as well.
Yes, there are. Indianapolis Airport Police is accredited. The same standards apply to them, although they may not provide all of the services that Columbus, Indiana Police Department provides. They are assessed on only those standards in which they provide the service for. So, for example, there's a chapter on campus law enforcement. The Indianapolis Airport Police probably does not provide campus law enforcement services to anyone. So that whole chapter would be what's called not applicable to them, and we'd skip over that basically because they do not have that responsibility. But yes, campus law or airports are eligible. In our region, Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan are all accredited.
Just received another question. What event to accreditation?
So I flip my headphone around to see if I can hear any better, but I still can't.
What event accreditation for law enforcement? Are you able to hear me better?
All I can hear is kind of like a muffled sound. I don't hear any words.
Unmuted or what?
Well, since I asked a question, perhaps I can repeat it.
I can hear you clearly.
Okay. What would be the advantages for a law enforcement agency to be accredited? Sort of like, what's in it for them?
What's in it for them?
So I imagine there's a cost to it.
Yes, indeed. As I mentioned in the presentation, it's a roadmap for success. What's in it for them, and this really, the Great Lakes region is predominantly a union environment, right? So police agencies normally have police unions in a lot of these areas, but there are some that do not have unions, and so that is probably a better example for me. In a union environment, those employees know exactly what benefits, compensation, and et cetera, that they're going to receive in their employment. In a non-union environment, that might not be the case. And the agency or the community may just decide one day we're going to pay you $20 an hour, but next week, we found that we don't have enough funding, and so we're going to cut your pay to $15, and there's nothing the employee can do. So by part of our process is they have to describe in detail all of those types of issues, compensation, benefits, etc. So the benefit is that it's now on paper and the employees know it. It's more transparent then for the employees. And if it's more transparent for employees, it's also more transparent for the community itself, because the agency has to provide direction to its employees in all areas of the law enforcement field. And so you will typically find that the law enforcement agencies that are accredited are better prepared to handle crises when they do occur. Some of the ones in recent past, some of the use of force incidents that have not turned out really well. Agencies have been able to address them and not have other issues come up, because they do address them right away rather than trying to sweep it under the rug or whatever the issue might be. But accredited agencies are ready to handle those type of emergencies because they have the procedure set out ahead of time. Obviously, as I mentioned before, one of the main things is they can now prove to boards such as city commissions and councils that they are upholding to best practices in the industry, because that's done by an independent authority. That was always my selling point to my city council when I was chief of police, because none of them had been police officers. None of them had even been in any public position at all until they took office as a city council member. They were business people or nurses or whatever it might be. So they were never police officers, so they didn't understand that culture. They didn't understand the profession. And so now they had an independent organization verifying to them that their agency was maintaining the proper standards. So it's real similar to, if you would think about it like a financial audit. I'm sure the city of Columbus does a financial audit every year, even though you might have very talented financial people in the finance department or comptroller's office, whatever you call them. You have to have someone check, right? Have to have someone verify that the honest people are still doing the honest work. So the same thing is applied here to law enforcement. It's an audit to make sure everyone is doing things the way it should be done.
Dan received a few more questions now. One of them I will answer is, does the Columbus Police Department employees belong to a union? And the answer is no. There is not a union that we belong to. A couple others for you. How many states have accredited members? How many states is Calea currently in the United States? You know?
Right off the top of my head, I think we are in every state except for Minnesota right now. In Minnesota, it's because of the way their use of force laws are written. They believe that they cannot come into compliance with the Calea standard because their law mandates that they cannot have any other wording, and they can't make it any more strict than what Calea mandates.
Another question is, does Calea provide use of force data to the FBI? And if not, why not?
Calea itself does not provide data because it's not our data. Agencies provide their data to us and we store it. And most of our agencies do provide that data to the FBI. And in fact, there is a standard that requires reporting to state reporting systems, and so that, in theory, or I should say, in a stepped process, you would report to the state of Indiana. Indiana reports to the FBI. So it's kind of a dual-stepped kind of a process.
Another question on training. Does Calea provide training, and if an agency is doing a poor job, does Calea come in and help them improve?
Again, Calea is an auditing and credentialing organization. We do provide training for our accreditation managers. So we provide accreditation manager training at all of our conferences. We also invite instructors from those who are hosting a conference. So for example, our next conference was supposed to be in Little Rock, Arkansas. Because of COVID-19, obviously we can't go to Little Rock, Arkansas, but Little Rock, Arkansas Police Department and their neighbors around them have all been asked to provide training. And so we will do that training virtually rather than at Little Rock PD. So if they have experts in use of force, they have experts in pursuit driving, maybe they have an expert in crisis intervention techniques or whatever the topic may be, they can put them forth as a trainer and provide training to others.
Has Calea been able to quantify what impact Calea accreditation has made on agencies, improved PR?
I think that can only be done anecdotally, meaning I don't have a statistic and I can't prove it. Just like we can't prove drug abuse resistance education is 100% effective. We believe it is, but we can't absolutely prove it. So the only thing I can relate to is my own observations. I can tell you when I first became a chief at my first agency, I had just gotten the agency through the accreditation process, and I still had to ask people for their reports that they were, if they come due. Hey, I'm looking for your pursuit analysis, Lieutenant. I'm looking for your use of force report, Lieutenant. So you had to keep on top of people. When I went to my second agency, they had been accredited for about 23 or 4 years. They'd been in the process a long time. I walked in, sat at my desk, and reports just hit my desk. I mean, it was automatic. And so all I can say is that agency then provided information to me that I needed to make decisions for my agency and also to provide to my community. So in that respect, I think it was a huge benefit. The other area that was a benefit that I've seen, and I know others have as well, is in the reduction of liability in civil litigation. One of the first questions that is usually asked when you go in front of a court, if you're being sued, is about accreditation. And do you have a policy on whatever the issue is you're being sued over? And so my agency, when I was chief of police anyway, we were excused from 3 federal lawsuits, and I maintain this because of accreditation, because the issues that were involved probably would not have had a written directive involved with them. But because we did, and we provided training in that written directive to all of our employees and can prove that all of our employees knew what the policy was, we were then excused from that lawsuit. So I think what people have seen, at least the studies I've seen from insurance carriers that provide insurance to municipal entities, is that the likelihood of being sued is less. If you are sued, because you still can be sued, accreditation is not a shield. Bad things can still happen. So if they do happen, it's less likely that you're going to have a large payout on a lawsuit because the agency can prove that it has adequate training, supervision, and direction.
If a police agency loses accreditation, is reasons made public?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear all of that, Chief. I'm sorry.
Somebody's typing.
I think I took care of that just now. If a police agency loses accreditation, is the reason made public?
And the last part is what I can't hear.
If an agency was to lose its accreditation, does CLEA make that public?
Oh, do we make it public? I'm sorry. We do. We post it on our website. We send letters to the elected officials in your state. We provide the agencies with a model press release. We feel because this is a voluntary program that it should be up to the agency how they want to announce and when they want to announce accreditation or reaccreditation. On the flip side, if an agency is denied accreditation, which very rarely does that happen, because we work with that agency to simply remove themselves from the process, rather than decline accreditation and remove them themselves. We will get with that agency and say, here are the issues. It's very unlikely that the commission is going to reaccredit you. Why don't you remove yourself from the process, re-enter again, and make the changes necessary and try again. And so usually that's what happens in our process. And that is, we allow the agency again to make that public if they choose. And I've had that happen. I've been involved in a couple different assessments where that had occurred, and I was, if you will, the second team in. And the agency had made that known to the public that they had re-entered the process after one failed attempt.
This is a several-part question. In your experience, what is the process to verify the veracity of data?
Well, that's a pretty good question. We verify the numbers to make sure that the numbers are all correct. But again, this is a voluntary process. We rely on the agencies that are participating to validate that information for us. And so if we do see some inadequacies, if you will, in the reporting, assessors will generally ask for information and more detail about what they're seeing in those numbers. And so we will dive deeper into those numbers if it appears that there's something that is a little bit out of skew. I've had that happen several times on assessments when I was a team leader assessor, and found it was an honest mistake, or it's just something that wasn't handled by the police agency in one incident. An agency with thousands of employees reported that it did not have any employee grievances or employment-related complaints over a 3-year period. They had none, but yet they had fired 40, 50 employees over that 3-year period. Now, where I'm from, every one of those would have a grievance attached to it because that's just the way the union environment worked. And so I investigated further, found out that there was a separate city entity that handled employee grievances. And so it was totally outside of the police department. I went and visited that agency and got all the information I needed.
And you may have already answered it with what you said, but that part of that question is what happens if data submitted to Calea is erroneous or inaccurate?
Yep, and so we'll attempt to verify it and then update it if possible, for sure. The information that we collect, just so I'm clear, is quite basic, and it's probably information that your police agency is already providing publicly. Use of force numbers, internal complaint numbers, that type of thing. They're probably already reporting that to the city council or city commission, whatever you call them. I know I did, and so that was easy to come up with that data because I provided it on a monthly basis, let alone an annual basis. So I always had those numbers for the community.
Does Calea audit whether agencies submit required data to the state and whether it was accurate?
We do not, only because it's not our data. We do not have access to all those systems. And so we rely on the agency to ensure that that data is accurate. Again, if we see that things are out of skew a little bit, maybe if we're talking crime data, we do ask for crime data within our reports. And so if we see that the number of calls for service is one number, but yet their numbers of actual crimes reported to the FBI seem to be totally out of whack, we're definitely going to follow up on that and try to figure out where those numbers are either wrong or maybe they're accurate and there's a good explanation for it.
As we have seen nationwide, some investigations involving use of force are extremely messy as to what actually happened. There are different versions. Is that investigated immediately, or does it wait for public comment for accreditation?
Well, again, we are a non-investigatory agency, and so we're not going to investigate any singular incident for use of force. That's not our responsibility. That's the responsibility of your local law enforcement agency, or based on whatever agreements they may have with county prosecutor, district attorney, whatever you call them. And so we're going to, again, verify numbers. If that incident is reported to us, we are going to make sure that the agency followed standards based on that incident. But we're not going to come in to investigate that case when it occurs.
Are there accreditation standards for body cameras as to when and if they may be turned off during use of force?
Excuse me. Our standard on body cameras, body-worn cameras or in-car cameras, allows the agency's discretion to determine when they're to be turned on and when they're to be turned off. The standard does, however, require periodic review by a supervisor of those videos to make sure that that all employees are in compliance with those rules. So it is quite detailed as far as the standard, but we allow the agency to determine when turning on and off a camera is required.
That's currently all the questions I have. Are there any other questions? Let's proceed to another one.
Just as a follow-up, Chief, to that last question, we would verify through the assessment that that employees are turning on and off the camera as allowed by your directive. So, but you would set whatever that standard would be. We would just verify that your employees are adhering to that.
Next question is for the police department itself. They want to know what information we release to the council, board of works, or the public. In our yearly report, we release all of the use of force, the arrest data, traffic stop. We release all that information in our yearly report. So we do present that. And we also are releasing our use of force report to the, making it public to the NAACP on a quarterly basis. Currently doing that as well. It's something we just recently started.
So you also release that to the Columbus Police Review Board. What do you give them?
Correct. Yeah, the complaints we get, we're releasing the use of force to them as well. Something that we just recently started making those changes. Not seeing any more questions coming up. Obviously, if there are more questions that people have, they're more than welcome to send those to me or email them or call me, and we will get them to Dan, and if we don't have an answer ourselves, and have him get an answer one way or the other. So I'm not seeing anything else. Anybody else here have questions? Dan, I appreciate your time. Hopefully it's very helpful. I think it was for us in here, and appreciate you taking the opportunity to help the community understand more about Calea and why it's beneficial to us.
Not a problem, Chief. I appreciate the opportunity. I hope that I left everyone with a little bit more information than what they had when they started as far as accreditation. And if there are any questions, obviously, do forward them to me and I'll be happy to help.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.